In 1991, the skies above Iraq lit up with weapons the world had never truly witnessed in action. Many of those systems still define how wars are fought in 2025, and some of their lessons were badly misunderstood. From stealth aircraft that left Baghdad seemingly blind to guided bombs striking with precision, this conflict reshaped the battlefield. Yet the most decisive tools were often invisible: satellites, jammers, and calculated psychological pressure that eroded the will to fight. By the end, Desert Storm produced a template of modern war. To understand how, we must return to its opening shock. The war that changed everything. The Gulf War is often remembered as the first conflict that unfolded in real time on television screens. For audiences around the world, the night skies of Baghdad burning under streams of tracer fire provided images unlike anything seen in previous wars. Color broadcasts transmitted by satellite erased physical distance and made combat immediate, something not confined to newsreels or after-action reports. The pictures were vivid, but what they captured was only the visible layer of a much larger transformation. Behind the footage lay the rapid collapse of what had been considered one of the strongest militaries in the Middle East. Iraq's armed forces numbered in the hundreds of thousands and were equipped with thousands of tanks, artillery batteries, and armored vehicles. Its air force was vast, and its elite Republican Guard, armed with modern Soviet-built weapons, was the vanguard of the regime's power. After nearly a decade of war with Iran, these units were combat-tested and expected to resist fiercely. Yet within weeks of facing the coalition, the very structure of this force crumbled with surprising speed. The reason was rooted not only in firepower, but in the way the coalition combined mass strength with new forms of information control and precision. Decades of Cold War preparation ensured the United States and its allies could move immense amounts of men and materiel across oceans and sustain them in distant theaters. Within 6 months of the invasion of Kuwait, a coalition force of roughly 1 million troops had been built up in the Gulf, an extraordinary demonstration of logistics at scale. But it was the fusion of that Cold War depth with newly operational technologies that shifted the balance in ways few had anticipated. Air operations provided the clearest demonstration. Coalition aircraft executed over 100,000 sorties during the campaign, establishing dominance in the skies and systematically degrading Iraq's ability to resist. What struck observers was not just the volume, but the precision. Stealth aircraft evading radar, strike packages guided by real-time surveillance, and satellite navigation directing forces across featureless desert. These tools pulled apart Iraq's command structure before its main units were even engaged. Once the ground war began, the coalition rolled over positions that had already been stripped of cohesion and situational awareness. This was not the victory of hardware alone. Many of the platforms in use were by no means new. The average age of American aircraft in the fight was over a decade. What mattered was how they were used in concert, supported by highly trained crews and an unprecedented integration of information systems. Surveillance aircraft stitched together a comprehensive picture of the battlefield. Digital communications gave commanders updates in minutes rather than hours. Precision-guided munitions, though only a minority of the bombs dropped, delivered outsized effects by striking critical bridges, bunkers, and communications hubs with single shots. The result was a series of cascading breakdowns in coordination that Iraqi units could not counter. Here the war revealed its true character, the merging of traditional mass with emerging information-age precision. Armored formations, infantry, and artillery still dictated the final push, but they did so within an environment already shaped by systems that magnified their effectiveness. Iraqi defenses collapsed not because tanks disappeared from the battlefield, but because those tanks could no longer operate as a connected whole. Their supporting infrastructure, supply corridors, command links, and defensive networks was methodically dismantled through targeted strikes. Television coverage, while striking, could not fully convey this deep disintegration. It showed the flashes of bombing raids and advancing columns, but not the underlying erosion of capability that came before those images. On the surface, the spectacle was of modern firepower. Beneath it, the decisive shift was in how wars were directed, fused across domains in ways Iraq's older systems could never counter. This imbalance underscored the gulf that had opened between militaries that had embraced new technologies and those that had not. Iraq's arsenal was large but dated. Its defenses were designed for Cold War battles of mass and attrition. Against satellite-guided navigation, stealth incursions, and integrated communications, they proved brittle. Numbers alone could not compensate for being blind, cut off, and relentlessly targeted by precision strikes. The legacy of 1991 rests here. For the coalition, the war was more than a regional victory. It was a proof of concept. Stealth was no longer experimental. Precision guidance was not a niche, but a strategic multiplier. What had seemed gradual improvements in the 1980s abruptly demonstrated themselves as revolutionary when tested in unified combat conditions. Nations far beyond the Middle East took notice, recognizing that the balance of effectiveness had shifted from mass to information-enabled precision. 3 decades later, many of the operational practices first validated in Desert Storm remain core features of advanced militaries. Satellite navigation, which once guided mechanized brigades across desert terrain, underpins every modern deployment. Stealth design principles pioneered in the F-117 continue in the F-35 and B-21. Precision strikes, once a small fraction of overall munitions, now dominate Western arsenals in both capability and doctrine. Above all, the emphasis on dismantling an adversary's command and control at the outset became a central premise for modern warfighting strategies. It is for these reasons that the Gulf War is often described as a conflict that marked a dividing line in military history. It illustrated that mass armies and industrial firepower were no longer enough in isolation. The decisive edge lay in the ability to blind, isolate, and paralyze an opponent through control of information and precision application of force. The lessons drawn in 1991 have continued to shape strategy and procurement for decades, cementing Desert Storm's place as the war that changed everything. And yet, while the ground campaign was swift, the outcome had already been decided before tanks rolled across the desert. The true story begins not on the sand, but in the skies, where the coalition stripped away Iraq's most formidable defenses long before the ground fighting began. Air superiority, the true decider. Why did Iraq's Air Force, counted in the late 1980s as one of the largest in the world, appear to disappear almost overnight once the fighting began? On paper, it possessed hundreds of fighters, bombers, and ground attack jets, many drawn from Soviet designs and hardened by years of war against Iran. Its defenses included radar stations, missile batteries, and a dense belt of anti-aircraft artillery. Yet instead of contested skies and costly dogfights, coalition aircraft seized control in the war's opening hours. The explanation lies in how deliberately the coalition achieved air superiority, combining coordination, suppression of defenses, and stealth into a decisive strategy. The first major step targeted Iraq's ability to detect and respond. Before bombers even crossed into hostile airspace, command planners had mapped out a systematic scheme to cripple the nation's surveillance network. Airborne Warning and Control System aircraft, AWACS, flew beyond Iraqi reach, orchestrating hundreds of coalition fighters, electronic warfare planes, and strike groups under a single integrated picture. These airborne platforms provided near-instant detection of any Iraqi aircraft attempting to take off, guiding fast interceptors like the F-15 and F-16 directly to them. That constant oversight ensured Iraq never had the chance to regain control of its skies. Iraq's defenders quickly found themselves up against methods designed to neutralize them. Stealth was the most novel tool. The F-117 Nighthawk, the world's first operational stealth combat aircraft, was sent against the densest defenses around Baghdad. Its geometry and radar-absorbing materials made tracking it nearly impossible. In the opening wave, F-117s struck power stations, communications hubs, and hardened bunkers essential to Iraq's integrated air defense system. Within hours, key sectors were blinded, unable to pass instructions to missile crews or alert fighter squadrons. Operators were left staring at blank radar scopes, only to hear explosions ripping through critical nodes moments later. These gaps widened under relentless electronic warfare. Coalition aircraft carried jamming and deception pods to overwhelm Iraqi defenses. Surface-to-air missile batteries and radar-guided guns struggled to function inside a haze of false returns, ghost targets, and noise. In many instances, operators fired into empty sky, their systems tricked or disrupted by coordinated electronic attacks. Anti-aircraft fire lit up the night at phantom targets, while the actual strike aircraft released their munitions unchallenged. Iraqi air defenses were not obliterated at once, but rather rapidly degraded through a methodical suppression campaign that left their operators increasingly blind and disorganized. This did not go unnoticed by Iraqi pilots. Many recognized that climbing into coalition-controlled airspace meant certain detection by AWACS and almost immediate interception by superior fighters. A few attempted to fight, only to be shot down by radar-guided missiles before reaching their targets. The majority remained grounded, while large numbers of aircraft were eventually flown across the border into Iran, effectively removing them from the war. The decision to seek refuge underscored how fully the coalition had closed down the operational use of Iraqi air power. The intensity of the campaign reinforced this imbalance. Coalition forces flew roughly 116,000 combat sorties over 6 weeks, dispersing 88,500 tons of munitions onto command sites, supply corridors, and entrenched units. With skies uncontested, large strike packages could hit infrastructure deep inside Iraq with calculated precision, knowing escorts and electronic warfare aircraft would suppress what remained of the defenses. The steady tempo wore down Iraqi command and control, quietly ensuring that by the time tanks and armored brigades advanced, their opponents would be unable to coordinate a coherent response. Perhaps the most striking metric was the coalition's low aircraft loss rate, especially given the intensity of operations. Though some aircraft were brought down, most losses came from anti-aircraft artillery or short-range infrared-guided missiles, rather than Iraq's long-range surface-to-air systems or fighters. Against this backdrop of more than 100,000 sorties, the fact that only a handful of aircraft were destroyed highlighted the effectiveness of the strategy. Superiority had tilted so far in one direction that old methods of denial proved nearly useless. The ground campaign's rapid success cannot be separated from these weeks of air dominance. Bridges and supply depots were cut. Communication bunkers ceased to function. Tank divisions were frozen in place with no orders. Units that might have contested a mechanized advance sat in isolation, their capacity to maneuver shattered before the first armored spearheads crossed into occupied Kuwait. The massive army that Iraq deployed remained numerically imposing on paper, but much of its combat power had been neutralized by the absence of air cover and the collapse of its battlefield coordination. Looking back, the Gulf Air Campaign represented more than a localized success. It provided a model for how advanced militaries might fight wars into the future. The AWACS networks prefigured the kind of real-time surveillance and battle management systems now standard across NATO air forces. Stealth, proven effective for the first time under combat conditions, became a guiding principle for subsequent designs like the F-35 and the emerging B-21. Suppression of enemy air defenses through anti-radiation missiles, electronic attack, and deceptive tactics emerged as the essential first phase of modern air operations. Observers at the time could see the gap opening between a state struggling with legacy Soviet-era systems and a coalition wielding precision, integration, and information dominance. An Iraqi air force that had once shadowed Iran for nearly a decade without collapsing simply had no way to counter this fusion. The result was not merely coalition superiority, but air supremacy that persisted unchallenged until the conflicts closed. 3 decades on, Desert Storm's air operations continue to shape expectations in strategy and doctrine. Any major operation now assumes air control as the necessary condition for everything else. Without it, sustained offensive action or even defensive maneuvering becomes questionable. And the tools that made that possible in 1991, the seamless coordination of AWACS, the sharp edge of stealth platforms, and the rapid suppression of defenses, still frame how military planners conceive of war in 2025. That supremacy came at a cost to Iraq not only militarily, but psychologically. Once it became clear that coalition aircraft could strike anywhere, anytime, with almost no losses, the aura of protection normally associated with air defenses disappeared. Baghdad itself served as the most vivid testament to this reality. As each night residents braced for attacks that seemed to materialize from nowhere, without warning or visible approach. The stage was set for a new kind of campaign, one that revealed a different face of modern warfare under the cover of darkness. Stealth and the night bombing campaign. Baghdad's nights soon became the proving ground for a kind of aerial warfare the world had never seen. Long before any ground offensive began, the city's blackout-shrouded streets were lit by sudden, precise explosions. Defenses had been positioned to repel a massed aerial assault, but the attacks came instead from aircraft that could not be tracked and rarely even glimpsed. This was the debut of the F-117 Nighthawk in large-scale combat, an aircraft built from the ground up to be unseen and to strike with precision. At first sight, the Nighthawk looked unlike any fighter or bomber that had come before. Its blunt, angular surfaces seemed awkward, even ungainly, but they existed for a purpose. Those edges and facets scattered radar signals away from their source, while special materials reduced the amount of energy reflected back. To sensors guiding surface-to-air missiles across Iraq, the aircraft appeared as little more than a fleeting blip, too inconsistent to provide a usable target. Instead of relying on evasive maneuvers or overwhelming numbers, stealth sought to avoid detection entirely. In practice, this meant the world's most heavily defended capital could be penetrated without warning. When bombing raids over Baghdad began in January 1991, surface-to-air missile batteries and radar-guided guns had little success finding the attackers. Observers later described Iraqi crews firing vast stocks of ammunition into empty skies, desperately chasing faint or false contacts. The defenses were not rendered useless solely by the F-117. Jamming aircraft, anti-radar missiles, and AWACS coordination compounded the effect. But the Nighthawks helped blind crucial elements of Iraq's command and control system in those opening days, paving the way for follow-on raids that struck deeper and more frequently. This created a psychological dimension as significant as the physical destruction. In earlier wars, defenders could at least hear approaching bombers or see them massing. Here, explosions shattered facilities with no warning, eroding confidence that defenders could respond at all. Soldiers spoke of the disorienting quiet before sudden detonations, a silence that offered no time to brace or resist. Each night, command bunkers, power substations, and communications hubs disappeared in moments, leaving troops and civilians alike unsettled by the sense that nothing on the ground could stop what was coming. Inside Baghdad, uncertainty spread. Power grids flickered out, government ministries lost their communications links, and military installations found themselves isolated one after another. To those on the receiving end, the predictability of traditional bombing campaigns was gone. Iraqi radar operators never knew if a faint trace on their screen was real or a false ghost set up by electronic interference. The frustration of firing blindly only deepened the impression that their systems had already been defeated. Within weeks, many of the most critical command nodes were either destroyed or forced into improvised fallback modes. The Nighthawk's missions revealed more than just invisibility. They displayed the growing precision of Western strike capability. Individual aircraft often carried only 2 precision-guided bombs. These were not directed at sprawling barracks or industrial districts, but against hardened bunkers, leadership compounds, and transformer yards feeding the electrical grid. Operations that previously required dozens of conventional aircraft could now be carried out by a solitary pilot, using stealth to enter undetected, release a pair of guided munitions, and depart without loss. This economy of force compressed the scale of attacks while amplifying their strategic impact. The results did not go unnoticed abroad. Military planners in other nations had long measured the expected attrition of aircraft attacking a heavily defended city. Steep losses had been assumed inevitable. Instead, Baghdad, protected by some of the densest defenses in the region, was struck with unprecedented success and negligible losses by the attackers. Coalition aircraft as a whole flew over 116,000 combat sorties during the campaign and suffered only modest losses in return, a low rate that underscored the practical payoff of pairing stealth with coordinated suppression of air defenses. For observers outside Iraq, this was as alarming as the strikes themselves. A supposedly secure city could be dismantled from the air with minimal penalty to the attacker. The combined weight of conventional raids and stealth missions deepened the pressure on Iraq's leadership. Even though the F-117 represented only a fraction of total sorties, its strikes often provided the shock effects that undercut enemy morale. Iraqi generals never knew when or where the next hit would fall. A few facilities were destroyed in a single blow that bypassed defenses entirely. Each successful strike not only eliminated a target, but also made clear the defenses had no answer. That aura of invulnerability, maintained night after night, broke the cohesion of decision-making at the top. The Nighthawk was hardly flawless. Its stealth came with limitations in maneuverability, requiring computers to keep it stable in flight. Payload and range were modest compared to larger bombers. Even so, in its first true test, the aircraft exceeded expectations. By showing that penetrating strikes could reach the most protected sectors of a modern battlefield, the F-117 validated years of experimental design and secretive development. What had been viewed as a niche project in the 1980s instantly became a pivotal capability around which newer doctrines were built. From the broader historical perspective, the F-117's campaign over Iraq marked the point where stealth shifted from theory into core planning. In the years since, newer aircraft like the F-22 and F-35 have refined the concept with advanced computing and aerodynamics, achieving both stealth and agility. Programs like the B-21 bomber, now preparing for service, embody the same principle on a larger scale. Deny detection, infiltrate defended airspace, and strike with precision. While modern designs look more fluid and versatile than the jagged Nighthawks of 1991, the underlying logic can be traced directly back to those nightly missions over Baghdad. The Gulf War's night bombing campaign also provoked deep questions that linger to this day. Can conventional air defenses ever provide reliable protection against aircraft that avoid rather than confront detection? If so much ammunition was wasted against invisible or illusory targets in 1991, what would happen in conflicts where stealth platforms are deployed in even greater numbers? Iraq's experience showed that size and density of defenses do not guarantee safety. For many militaries, the lesson was unmistakable. Without the means to counter stealth, the strongest defensive networks could be unmade in weeks. Those nights redefined the image of air warfare. Where once the emphasis had been on overwhelming mass and visible destruction, Desert Storm presented a war of selective strikes, arriving suddenly and vanishing before a defense could react. For Iraq, this meant constant strain and mounting disruption. For the coalition, it meant that operations against high-value targets could proceed with confidence that losses would remain low. The disparities in technology and tactical approach made the difference, but the symbol that endured was the unseen aircraft delivering devastating precision under the cover of darkness. By 2025, the echoes of those strikes still shape both the aircraft flying today and the doctrines guiding their use. Stealth remains the threshold capability for surviving inside modern defensive networks, while precision weapons have become the expectation, not the exception. These principles are taken for granted now, but their dramatic debut took place in the deserts and skies of Iraq more than 3 decades ago. Yet the strikes themselves were only one part of the story. Just as critical as the platforms delivering them were the weapons they carried. The campaign's legacy cannot be understood only in terms of aircraft that avoided detection. It must also be measured in the accuracy of the bombs they dropped and the new way conflicts would be fought from then on. The rise of the smart bomb. The most striking shift in Desert Storm was not the aircraft themselves, but the weapons they carried. This was the conflict where the smart bomb first proved it could shape an entire campaign. While coalition aircraft still released the majority of their loads in the form of unguided munitions, it was the precision-guided strikes, the ones most vividly captured on television, that came to symbolize the war. They were a small minority in numerical terms, yet their impact far outweighed their share of the total tonnage dropped. Understanding that difference requires looking at how conventional bombs worked. Unguided weapons depended entirely on the pilot's release point, dictated by altitude, angle, and favorable weather.